Welcome along. It is the beginning of the football season. It is a time of wild, irrational optimism and sometimes justified optimism. It is a time of where we let go of despair for a few precious seconds before the referee blows the whistle on the kickoff. Then the usual relentless waves of disappointment, despair, and contemplation of suicide return for most of the football fans who actually watch and endure the cavalcade of rubbish that's served up and presented to us as football by most of the clubs in the Premier League and indeed most of the Football League. I speak, of course, from the bitter perspective of Sheffield Wednesday fan, but we throw over now live to Liverpool to a man who is positively swimming on a sea of optimism. It's Mr. Rick Grimes of the Class Consciousness Project.
Hello, everyone, and it's fantastic to be back doing this Football Focus podcast again. Hopefully this can be a very regular, reoccurring thing, especially with the amount of information and issues that go along in the football world. But it was a very enjoyable night last night to watch Liverpool snatch 3 points from the jaws of a draw as Newcastle were considerably outplaying us for most of the matches here. A new record being held by the 16-year-old Rio, scored in the very dying minutes of the game. So that was interesting, but we're not here to talk about scores and results. There's other places to do that.
Yes, indeed. If you want that, then the Athletic podcast has you covered. But what we're here to do with this particular program is to look deeper into things that are going on in the football world that relate partially, at least, to the questions of class, such as, well, who is modern football provided for? Is it something which is in touch with its roots as a working class game, or is it in terms of the top division sides, a gigantic corporate behemoth that it works on selling itself as a series of global brands around the world to the detriment of the accessibility of the sport to the fans and the communities that made these clubs what they are? But we'll be revisiting that in other times and future podcasts with a variety of different guests as well, which we'll have on. But today, I wanted to lower the mood even further than we're already on in terms of where we are, in terms of like plunging further into a sea of football depression and talk about Sheffield Wednesday. Now, yeah, I know. It is that bad. But if you didn't know, Sheffield Wednesday are my own club because I grew up in this sort of slither of northern Derbyshire, which lies roughly between Greater Manchester and the Sheffield area. And so, like, growing up in the mid-90s, most of the lads at school ran towards Man United because they were just starting their period of dominance that I would say ran roughly from, well, when the first time they won the league again, back in 92, 93, all the way through till really the retirement of Alex Ferguson and the shriveling of Man United to their current form, which actually might be a fun thing to talk about in future programs, given that both of us hate Man United with a passion. Rick?
Yeah, that'll be an interesting discussion to see the Premier League's darling, who still essentially is able to spend exuberant amounts of money whilst being a relegation fodder almost team. Fingers crossed.
Yes. Well, let's hope so. That would be very, very funny. But to return to the point about why I made the masochistic decision in 1995 to support Sheffield Wednesday, it was because essentially I didn't want to follow all the glory hunters running desperately towards Man United. I didn't want to support Stockport County for, very good reasons. So I thought, well, I'll support one of the Sheffield clubs, and Wednesday seemed like the better option at the time. Now, that was 95. As I say in the article, which by the time this is broadcast, the article will be up on the project website. Went to my first game in 1996 versus Queen's Park Rangers at home. Queen's Park Rangers are my dad's team because he grew up in North London, and the game I thought started great because we went ahead, and then we ended up losing 3-1 in an undignified and squalid performance that set the tone for a disappointing year. So the point about this isn't, though, just to reminisce about not very unenjoyable football experiences, though that might actually be a good future episode. The point is that Wednesday are currently facing a crisis in terms of a gigantic amount of debt and the, shall we say, the belligerent and destructive ownership of Mr. Chancerai, who is a Thai steel magnate who took over the club a few years ago. But even though a lot of the fans blame him for the current problems which got so severe that there was a doubt whether Wednesday would even be able to start the season because players weren't being paid and there was all kinds of problems behind the scenes. Danny Rule, the German guy who took over as manager quite recently, actually, he departed from the club before in pre-season, so there's all kinds of disruption going on. And it caused me to write the article because, in actual fact, to trace the origins of the debt problem for Sheffield Wednesday, you actually need to go back to the time I actually started going to Wednesday as a teenager, which is like around about 1996. Because what happened in that early Premier League era, and Rick, you'll probably want to chime in on this, is that a lot of clubs decided to try and do what I would argue Blackburn Rovers did, which is that they got one rich guy behind them. That in case of Blackburn Rovers, it was Jack Walker, who was a steel magnate himself, though localized, I think, around like the northwest area. He put a lot of money into Blackburn Rovers, who prior to the early 90s hadn't been about much in terms of league performance or cup performance for a very, very long time. And he took them from being an also-ran at best to almost winning the title one year and winning it the next year. But then following Jack Walker's withdrawal from active participation in the club and death soon afterwards, Blackburn Rovers went on a skid from which they've never really recovered from. But it was very influential at the time, this idea that you could borrow a lot of money or spare or commit a lot of cash to a mid-ranking club, which is what Wednesday were. We had not been like a sort of consistent title winner for a very long time, arguably since like the 1920s, early 1930s. Occasionally, Wednesday would have a good cup run. Occasionally, we'd get back in the top division and make a play for like the top six. But mostly, we were a mid-table top division side or a top-end second-tier side for a long time. The run under Ron Atkinson and Trevor Francis was actually one of the better ones we'd had for quite some time. So we finished third in the last season of the old Division 1. We finished seventh twice. We made like the two cup finals where we got beat twice by Arsenal. But all through that time, the club was spending more and more on imports. And by the time we got to like 96, 97, 98, this club was spending a lot on players like Benito Carboni, on players like the formidable Reggie Blinker, if anybody can remember him, on players like Wim Jonk, Gilles de Builder, not Bob, if anybody can remember that particular joke. This was money that was being spent, but it was being wrapped up in the form of debt by decisions taken by another steel man, Dave Richards, who did come out of the steel industry to be Sheffield being an old steel town. Very little of it left now, though. But he racked up that debt to the point by the year 2000, it was like 18, 19 million. And the problem was that this was all leveraged on the idea that we were going to get European football. And that would basically enable the debt to be essentially serviced every year and just kept there. This fell apart when we didn't get European football. Like 1/7th place finish under David Pleat was not repeated. Pleat was sacked. They went through a series of managers, ending with Danny Wilson, who was a former Wednesday player, who ultimately got us relegated in the early 2000s. And that is the point which the debt became unsustainable, because there was no, the Premier League parachute payment that you do get was not as extensive as it is now back then. So it was very hard to keep that 18 to 19 million quid service. So to summarize like the situation, we went through a series of managers and owners, including notorious characters like Milan Mandaric, who sought to essentially kept restructuring the debt, paying bits of it off, but it's never been addressed in terms of the overall picture of the finances, like we've never actually addressed the core of the problem, which is going into debt, leveraging the ground, leveraging other assets to try and keep the club going, gambling on promotions that never quite happen. And now we've reached the point where there was a turn to this Chansiri guy, who is, again, comes in from Thailand, looking like he's going to be the savior. He did spend some money, but then he starts like refusing to because partly because the fans had a go at him and he threw a fit. And like basically these billionaires, very thin-skinned people. And now the club's right back in literally in the shit again, facing potential like point stocking for and getting penalties for like not being able to balance the books, not being able to pay the bills. And Wednesday are like the latest in a very long line of teams that this has happened to, who overspent to try and stay in the Premier League, who borrowed money to do it, who include teams like Bolton Wanderers, who were in the Premier League for a long time, and of course, big Sam Allardyce. And then they had a decent team like 15, 16 years ago, and then it all just falls apart. So that's the situation that Wednesday are in now. And the interesting thing about it is that, unfortunately, it's only a minority of the fans who actually get what the problem is. The problem is that fundamentally, that we have adopted an unsustainable spending model 25 years ago, and we've never recovered from it. And so it's not just that Chansiri is an arsehole, even though he is. It's not just that the club's been mismanaged for years, even though it has. It's that the root cause of the problem, which is a massive overspend that's never been properly handled, never been properly addressed. That's never been resolved. And we keep diving back into this situation because all the clubs like Wednesday are just desperate to get back into the Premier League, get some of that money again. And there's not enough space in the Premier League for that. And also, it's a reckless gamble anyway. So I'll leave my sort of overview of the article there. Go and read it because there's a lot of interesting facts in there that says a lot about the way modern football's gone. But I've talked for a bit. But Rick, do you want to chime in on this and any related issues that you think this brings up?
Yeah. Well, you've said a lot there, mate, and there's a lot to go through. So you can go back to the 80s with Liverpool and Everton. You can go back to the 60s and 70s with Man United and Leeds and see these teams that used to spend a lot of money. But the dangers of spending that amount of money wasn't so rigorous because even the lower league teams, you could fall into, like Liverpool got relegated under Shankly, and it wasn't so detrimental as it is now. Now, the Premier League, as the advent of the Premier League in '91, created a massive influx of money into football. It's the Americanization of British football, when all the teams essentially quit the National League, the top teams, and joined the Premier League. And this was created, this massive behemoth of a football league to rival anyone else. So dropping out of the Premier League now is, and has been, obviously, you've got the parachute payments, like you mentioned now, which do help the blow, but the mass amount of money in comparison is exponential. So to leave the Premier League now, it hurts. So when you say like Jack Straw, was it Jack Straw, Blackbird?
Yeah,
Jack Straw. Sorry, when they did it, Man United had already spent a bit of money. Newcastle had a little bit of a go, but that was the first time I would say that I could clear in my head where you could see it's a club go out and spend a mass amount of money, and then they won the league. You know, nobody saw that coming. They won the league, and then they fell away as all players started to go. Funnily enough, anecdotally, they turned down Zinedine Zidane, saying, "We're okay, we've got Tim Sherwood."
Well, who wouldn't want that as your ideal midfield general, you know?
Well, Tim Sherwood was a great player, but I think I would have preferred Zidane as he's...
Well, we turned down Cantona in 1991 because Trevor Francis didn't think he was up to it.
Hey, well, listen, he was on the bench at Leeds, wasn't he? It was only Ferguson that seen that maybe he could lead the line and turn United into the force that they were, the utter Premier League monsters that they were through the 90s. But going back to what we're talking about heavy spending, it's been a model that everybody has used through the Premier League from, I'd say, the mid-90s onwards until most recently, when you had financial fair play for when you were in any of the UEFA competitions, and now with the PSR rules, which is looking at putting blocks onto this, but it's a long old-winded thing to talk about that. At the moment, it looks more like it favours the bigger teams, but there are other discussions, so we'll leave that for another day. But one of the ones that I'd like to compare you to is Leeds under David O'Leary with Peter Ridsdale. Now, they spent a fortune, and that team, Paul Robertson, Ian Hart, Gary Kelly, Lucas Radaby, Tony Abo was a bit before that, but then he had Mark Viduka, Harry Kewell, who came to Liverpool, made 100-odd appearances, and I only remember the one where he limped off in the final. And had to throw that in there. But they spent so much money, and they actually got themselves into the Champions League. They were into the quarterfinals one season, and then they started to fall away when the debts become unsurmountable. They borrow against the club with the hope that they will be able to see a return of this by success, wins, TV rights. The Premiership money is massive. So when Leeds started to fall away, the contracts that they had signed, he had to get rid of half these players, didn't he? One guy I heard was remember a left back from Derby County called Seth Johnson. Remember him? Got one England cap. He was looked to be there, very left back. Leeds signed him just about the start of the decline. Now he moved 2 clubs on after Leeds, and because of what they had given him with a contract, years later he was still being paid by Leeds because they were so frivolous, as it sounds like Sheffield Wednesday are. Now, 2 seconds. Now, other clubs started to look at this model, didn't they? There's teams like Brighton before the pandemic and the lockdown and the football went crazy. Everyone, we won the league behind closed doors and it never felt like we did. Brighton used to sign players, good young players, big contracts, bring them in and expect to sell them on. Swansea did have a bit of a similar model. Bring the players through, know you're going to sell them, but keep finding these gems, and you could pay these guys big money just to get them to come here, knowing that you could sell them on. So that was how they grew and became this team that Chelsea now feed off of. When the pandemic hit, nobody could really buy players. There's no money, no fans were going. It shows where the money comes from. You still got your TV rates, but it shows how much money that comes in from the fans because nobody could spend any money then. And Brighton couldn't sell these players, so they were left with these massive long-term contracts with these players they could no longer afford. So this model of speculation with money is always going to run yourself into a cul-de-sac where at one point you're stuck and it will cause you damage. And it sounds like that's what's happened with your club.
Yeah, it all depends upon being able to present to the creditors a credible idea that they're going to get paid at some point. And once that road has run itself into a dead end, that's the point where trouble starts. So, like a lot of other corporations which depend upon like a gigantic amount of debt. So, like, there's a lot of like businesses in Britain today that are essentially zombies, meaning that they exist because they can just about service the gigantic amount of debt that they're carrying around with them. They can convince the banks and the other creditors that they are still credible for future payments on that debt. And again, that only lasts as long as you're able to essentially convince people that that's the case. If you look at a club like Bury, for instance, who haven't been a top division club, well, the creditors became unconvinced of their ability to pay anything off a lot quicker than they would a bigger club, and they got, as a consequence, liquidated and had to be started again as a fan-owned operation. And in my view, this is really where the likes of Wednesday are heading. That's why I conclude the article saying that if this is going to have any future, it's not going to be as like some, top of the tree club anymore, because essentially the money's not there for it. And essentially, like, we as fans shouldn't be looking for a billionaire oligarch as some kind of savior anymore, because for a start, a lot of these guys don't invest their own money. because, you don't get to become a billionaire by gambling recklessly on with your own cash. You gamble recklessly with somebody else's. And that's why, like, ultimately, if Wednesday are going to be saved in some form or another, like, I would rather that we take the name, take the achievements in the way that, like, say, AFC Wimbledon have done, and have to start again. Because what kind of, like, life is it, footballing life, to, like, to go and spend, like, 50 odd, 60 odd quid, which is what it costs to get in now, to even a club like Wednesday. So you go and, like, spend a hell of a lot of money. If you take yourself, like, your children, like, you have a beer when you're there, you end up spending, like, upwards of, like, 80, 90, 100 quid to see a second tier game, which is not something which a lot of people in, like, the Sheffield area can actually afford to do very much of anymore, or any working class area in the country. I would rather that we basically ended this farce, started the club again as a fan-owned operation, and clambered our way up through the lower leagues, because then at least you can have a club which is actually rooted in its community again, which is actually something which workers can go to and enjoy a day out, rather than having to, like, save up for God knows how long to go for one afternoon to see what is frankly like an increasingly, like, so to say, poor and stagnant display anyway from a demoralized team a lot of the time. So one of the things that I want to do on this feature, as a feature in the future, is highlight some of these, like, fan-owned clubs that have been started, because there is the possibility of it being like a genuine working class community game again. The problem is that by trying to get in with the big guys, you push the fan base further and further away, because the expenses go up and up and up. And for a club like Wednesday, that's proved to be absolutely fatal. But we will return to this story as things move on with the condition of my historic team, shall we say. And I'll certainly return to the story of fan-owned clubs, because there's quite a few in the area of sort of central Scotland where I live at the moment that have been gone over to fan ownership, including, like, Heart of Midlothian, who went through a nightmare period under an oligarch named Romanoff a few years ago. So we'll come back to that story. But Rick, I'll throw to you now for the second story of this week's episode.
Ah, yes. So now we're going to talk about essentially multi-club ownership. Now, recently Crystal Palace have won the FA Cup, first time in their recent history, and this comes with Europa League football. Now, we've seen this multi-ownership a lot the last 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years. You've seen the likes of Man United and Nice, City and Girona. And then let's never forget about the Red Bulls.
The multiple Red Bulls.
Multiple Red Bulls who were seen as not having that massive connection, even though their logos are exactly the same as the can that they try to promote. But Crystal Palace, anyway, were given a time frame to get their affairs in order with the multi-club ownership. Otherwise, with the new rules that were put in place, they could not be in the same league as the other team, which was Lyon, who was owned by a fellow called John Textor. I haven't got that much history on John Textor. I was looking into more of other stuff, but anyway. So John Textor owns 40% and then went to 45% of Crystal Palace. Now, we all know about Steve Parish, who saved up the consortium in 2010, did fantastic things with Crystal Palace Football Club. He even, they're now 26th in revenue in the world. Now, that's fantastic for the club like Crystal Palace, who have at points been a place where people go to retire. So Parish, then there was Dave Blitzer. Parish only had 10%. Dave Blitzer and Josh Harris had 18% between the two of them, and John Textor had 45%. But Steve Parish had, as chairman, 75% of the voting rights. So when this time period elapsed and Palace were told they can no longer be in the Europa Cup and were relegated to the Conference League, the argument was John Textor had no voting rights. Now, he had the controlling majority in Leon. He no longer has any more. Seems to have thrown his dummy out, but still has an interest in most clubs. He has since then sold his interest in Palace to Woody Johnson of Johnson and Johnson. What a fantastic firm they are! Like for 190 million, with a lot of that money going into Leon. But this was past the time that has been said to them for the multi-club rules now. Now, Palace's argument being twofold that, before I carry on, Nottingham Forest have taken the position in the Europa Cup, who themselves are part of a multi-club ownership, but they organised theirs before the time period. Their argument being for Palace anyway is that he didn't have a controlling stake, and the email with the new regulations went to a generic Palace inbox where they did not see and were not aware of. My thoughts on this is they did not expect to win the FA Cup. Sorry, this sort of glitching off a car outside. They did not expect to win the FA Cup. They did not expect Europa League football. So when they considered this, John Textor probably thought, it's not worth the risk me losing my small stake, my large stake in the club, or losing my say in the club, which he has been fighting for. Him and Steve Parish have had battles over control of Palace. There's been a bit of a discussion, and he's going to lose against Parish. Anyone is, because he is seen as the great saviour of Palace, isn't he? So I believe they just did not think that they would ever get to this stage. It's an interesting thing. Now, Palace feel rightly aggrieved because, as we said before, Man City, Man United, the Red Bull teams, they have all played in the same groups, the same cup competitions as these their other consortium-owned clubs. But these new regulations will come in place. On an anecdotal note, Man City have Pep's brother, I can't remember his name now, who is on the board of Man City and has big dealings with Girona. So when we talk about, interference between two clubs, there's obviously something there if somebody is heavily involved in both clubs. But yeah, they are to feel rightly aggrieved, but the rules have been put in place, and rules need to be implemented for the multi-club ownership, because if there isn't something there, this could be massively damaging to football. But at the same time, it looks like with the likes of Drogheda, they were kicked out with their Swedish club Silkeborg, and Forest themselves having a multi-club ownership. It just looks to me that Palace did not expect to get where they are. This John Textor sounds like a royally capitalist, conspiratorial man. He took all the money that he had, not all the money, he took a big chunk of the money that he earned from Palace, injected it into Leon, and then resigned from the board to put a steward in place. So and I would be inclined to agree that if these rules are to be put in place to stop this multi-club ownership, Palace have taken the fall for it, haven't they? As have Drogheda, but because they are a team that nobody really takes any notice of, it's not big headlines, but they are a smaller team that probably could have done with that cash injection. So I think Palace have just fallen on the sword. Man United, Man City, the Red Bulls, they have this strength with them with their consortiums. They know what they're doing, whereas this John Textor looks like he was more of a cowboy than the rest of them.
Well, he is from Texas, appropriately enough, originally. So that works. I mean, but it's the same basic problem that, like, a lot of the regulations that are brought in to football end up doing the opposite of what they're supposed to do. So, like this rule over like individuals who own controlling or like significant stakes in different clubs, like the likes of Ratcliffe and Ineos gets away with it. because he's able to essentially employ like an army of sports lawyers to argue his case. I mean, if we spread out the discussion point to like the whole financial fair play question, like where is, for example, Manchester City's case for the, what was it, 115 violations?
150 violations, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is supposed to be set for October this year, but every year this seems to be pushed back. Now, that started in 2009.
Yeah. So that's almost 20 years.
Yeah, it's being pushed because they have the ability, as you said, to do that.
Yeah, they have. If you have inexpensive enough lawyers, you can spin this out for as long as possible. And also, the question of the city and the multiple violations that they've been accused of. The other thing that keeps them safe from possible retribution on that point is that the other Premier League clubs have to pull the trigger on them if they're going to get relegated. For instance, so a club like Glasgow Rangers got relegated in the Scottish League when they were bankrupt. Juventus got relegated down to Serie C, I think. But to do that to City would also entail like awkward questions for the likes of Man United, for the likes of Chelsea and others who've sailed at the very least very close to the wind, or committed similar violations to City. So there is a certain sense where like the Premier League clubs now, certainly the big ones, represent what is in essence a cartel, which though they may be rivals on the pitch, when it comes to business decisions, a lot of the time they're going to back each other up because they don't want those rules to be applied to them. They don't want to see City pushed into the lowest possible league, even though that would be very funny for the likes of us, because again, like they're protecting their own interests by not pushing for a decision on City. So if the big Premier League clubs all said, well, we want this resolved, that might make a difference, but I would argue that they have no interest in doing so.
Well, interestingly, Steve Parish voted for a regulation that is being looked at by the FA to not allow any club with any stake in these multi-club ownerships to trade between each other, knowing that John Textor was on his board with a multi-club himself. So essentially that could work against Palace in itself, but work better for football. When we look at the likes of City and the PSR rules, that's a completely different aspect in itself. Now they've committed violations on the financial fair play, which only affects teams that are in the UEFA competitions, and then they've committed issues with the new PSR rules in recent times. But then, if we look at mid-season last year when they were doing, they were really struggling, they went out and signed 2 new fullbacks for Marmoush, who was one of the next Egyptian prince, as he calls himself, spending a small fortune. So they must know that they're not going to get the likes, the issues that other clubs have got, the smaller clubs have got. Well, you look at what they did with Everton. Everton fell foul of the PSR rules, and they gave them if I remember off the top of my head, an 8-point deduction, and then later on reduced it by 3, which just makes a mockery of the whole rules for me. If you've given them a deduction and then you come back and take it back, which they did fantastically to stay in the league over that. Forest themselves, now, if we're going to talk about Forest, we talk about their owner, Marinakis, who is essentially could be said as a very corrupt man. He's been looked at for match fixing in Greece. He's been looked at for being involved in allegedly being involved in drugs. So a lot of these rich, great owners probably are, but they overspent coming into the Premier League, buying players which they essentially couldn't afford. Fell foul of the PSR rules, have got a massive deduction. Then they were also banned from, if I'm right, dealing in the transfer window. But they'd already spent the money. They kept themselves afloat, and now they're seeing the benefits of that by being one of the top 10 teams. It's it just shows that it's essentially up to how good a capitalist the owner is, isn't it? With the when we're looking at the bigger teams, I think City are pushing this further and further and further because it becomes less in the public eye and becomes less of an issue if they don't get the points deduction. For City, if they get a fine, a monetary fine, it's nothing. If Everton had got a monetary fine, it would have been massive. City should be due a points deduction like everybody else, depending on what the ruling comes to. There was a lot to do with Mancini and paying him under the books, wasn't there? There was a few under the table things. So it's an interesting way this could go. But with Palace, I think they fell foul of rules that have been long awaited. If this was City or Man United at the time, maybe that wouldn't have happened. But Palace were just unable, and they didn't have a good enough capitalist to keep them out of it.
And that is the essence of the discussion that we've been having today, which is that what it's come to depend upon is how much you, as the owner of a club or the consortium that owns a club, is able to essentially manipulate the situation to keep the club on the road for another few years. Convince everybody that the debt's going to get paid, convince everybody that you've got a plan, manage to defer punishments that have been given to you by the Premier League or the Football League. And really the question that everyone's got to ask is this a sustainable way of any football club doing business? Now, we're going to present the arguments in a number of shows, I think, in the near future, that this isn't, nor should it be. But I think this is an excellent place to conclude our discussion for today. I think it's been a good way to kick off this new season of Football Focus. Rick, do you have any final messages for the people out there today?
Well, just to finish with what we were saying, this is the monopolisation of football, isn't it? And this is what we see in all capitalist enterprises. This is what we can look into Marxism and discuss about how this happens within late stage capitalism. And football is not alien to that. Football is now essentially big business, is large business. You're seeing countries buy clubs. Now, the Newcastle fans are fuming because the PSR rules have come in when they've gained millions and still can't sign players using that money. But yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Now, let's be honest. They, as you said, they're not going to ruin these businesses. They're not going to destroy these corporations. They are going to work this in the best way possible to keep the money flooded into the teams who create the most funds for the Premier League, because the Premier League is the big business, is the big capitalist modem of football. When we look at the likes of Man United, they are still one of the largest revenues whilst floundering halfway down the league and slowly decapitating themselves with poor choices over the years. But the Glazers came in and have essentially just asset stripped them. They've allowed leaky roofs and bad managers and poor players to come in as they borrow money against the club and keep themselves rich. But anyway, yeah, fantastic discussion. I'm looking forward to some more further down the line. Especially we will want to deep dive into the PSR rules, and then maybe we can play some old matches and discuss football back in the day. And we've got some great guests that are going to come on too.
All right. So thank you everybody for tuning in this time. We'll be back with you again for another episode of Football Focus, brought to you by the Class Consciousness Project. So until next time, thank you for tuning in, and see you again soon. And the obligatory scarf at the end, of course.